I still have the structural survey I filed that week. My supervisor never asked why half the measurements didn't match the blueprints. I think he already knew, and I think that's why he never sent anyone back. My name's Ray Ostrowski. I'm 34, a structural inspector out of Allentown, Pennsylvania, and back in October I got a contract to do a preliminary survey of the old Bethlehem steel plant on the south side of Bethlehem, the stretch along the Lehigh River where the blast furnaces still stand like rusted cathedrals. Most people who visit that site now come for the arts campus built around it, the concerts, the lit-up furnace towers people photograph at night. What they don't see is the part still fenced off, the original mill buildings behind the public section, condemned since the plant finally shut down machining operations for good. A development company wanted to convert part of it into loft apartments, and before anyone could pour a single dollar into that, someone needed to walk the structure and confirm what was salvageable and what wasn't. That someone was me. I'd done inspections like this before: old textile mills, a shuttered hospital once, a grain elevator that nearly killed me when a floor gave out under my boot. I wasn't the type to spook easy. I took the Bethlehem job partly for the money and partly because my daughter's braces needed paying for, and a 3-week contract at that rate covers a lot of orthodontic bills. I told my wife it'd be tedious, not dangerous. Old steel doesn't move. That's what I believed going in. Bethlehem Steel isn't some obscure ruin, either. That's part of what made me comfortable taking the job in the first place. Everyone in that part of Pennsylvania grows up knowing the skyline of those blast furnaces, 5 of them standing in a row along the Lehigh River like something out of a different century. At its peak, the company employed over 30,000 people at that site alone, turning out steel that went into the George Washington Bridge, the Golden Gate, half the skyscrapers people photograph in New York without ever knowing where the metal came from. The plant finally shut its last furnace down in 1995, and for years afterwards the whole complex just sat there, rusting, while the town figured out what to do with 164 years of industrial history. Eventually a chunk of it became the arts campus, steel stacks, with concerts held right underneath the furnace towers, lit up green and orange at night for tourists who take pictures without ever knowing men died building and running those things. The public loves that section. Almost nobody goes into the part still fenced off behind it, and until that October, I hadn't either. The first 2 days were exactly what I expected. I walked the number 2 machine shop with a hard hat, a laser measure, and a clipboard, documenting corroded I-beams and collapsed catwalks, the kind of decay you'd expect from a building that stopped running in 1995 and had been slowly eaten by weather ever since. The place smelled like rust and standing water and something underneath that I couldn't place at first, a faint metallic sweetness that the site manager, a retired steelworker named Henrik who still volunteered there part-time, told me was just old lubricant baked into the concrete. He'd worked the blast furnaces himself in the 70s. He liked to talk. He told me stories about shift changes, about men who worked 40 years in that mill and never once complained, about how the furnaces used to glow orange against the sky so bright you could see it from the Poconos on a clear night. He also told me, almost as an afterthought while locking up on my second evening, that I shouldn't linger past dark near the ore yard conveyor line, not because of any ghost story, just because the footing back there was unreliable and the county hadn't finished stabilizing it. I said sure, no problem, and meant it. By day 3, I'd started noticing small things I couldn't quite explain, nothing dramatic, just things that didn't sit right. I'd leave a section of the number 2 shop marked complete on my clipboard and come back an hour later to find my chalk marks on the beams erased, like someone had wiped them clean. I asked Henrik if the cleaning crew came through. He said there hadn't been a cleaning crew assigned to that building in 3 years. I found that odd but not alarming. Old buildings settle, dust shifts, chalk fades. I made a note of it and moved on. There was a security office near the main gate, mostly decommissioned, but a few of the old CCTV monitors still ran on a backup feed the county maintained for insurance purposes. I stopped in there on my lunch break that day, partly to warm up and partly because Henrik kept a coffee pot going, and one of the monitors was showing the number 2 shop floor, the exact section I'd just left. On the screen, faint and grainy, I watched my own chalk marks fade from a beam in real time, the way ink bleeds when it gets wet, except the beam was bone dry and nobody was anywhere near it. I asked Henrik if he saw it too. He glanced at the screen, shrugged, and said the old feeds glitched constantly, that the county kept meaning to replace the whole system and never got around to it. I wanted to believe him. I mostly did, for another day. The temperature drop started on day 4. Not the general chill of an unheated building in October, a specific, localized cold that I'd walk into near the old blowing engine house, a drop sharp enough that I could see my breath for exactly the length of that corridor and nowhere else in the building. I checked for broken windows, open vents, anything that could explain a cold pocket that specific. There was nothing. I logged it as an HVAC anomaly, even though the plant hadn't had working HVAC in decades, because writing something official sounding made it feel less like what it actually felt like, which was being watched. That afternoon, my recorder picked up something I didn't hear with my own ears. I'd taken to dictating notes as I walked, standard practice for a survey like this, and when I played the audio back that night in my motel room, underneath my own voice reading off beam measurements, there was a second sound running the length of the recording, rhythmic, metallic, like a hammer striking steel at slow, even intervals, the kind of sound 100 men working a line together might have made 60 years ago. I checked the timestamp against my own memory of that hour. I remembered the building being silent. Dead silent, the kind of silence you actually notice in a place that size. I told myself it was equipment settling, pipes contracting in the cold, anything with a rational shape to it. I've since learned that once you start needing to tell yourself something is fine, it usually isn't. Day 5 is when I found the logbook. I was documenting a section of the old quality control office, a cramped room off the main shop floor with 3 filing cabinets still standing and a desk bolted to the floor the way everything in that plant seemed to be bolted down, permanent, like the building itself refused to let anything be moved. One of the cabinets had a drawer that wouldn't fully close, and inside it was a logbook, leather-bound, water-damaged at the edges but legible, filled with handwritten shift reports going back to the 60s. I flipped through out of curiosity more than anything work-related. Most entries were mundane tonnage counts, equipment faults, a note about a foreman named Kowalczyk who apparently never showed up on time. Then, near the back third of the book, the entries changed. Shorter. Clipped. One read, Furnace 3 crew short again. Nobody remembers assigning anyone to replace him. Another, a few pages later, in a different hand, told them stop writing his name on the roster. He's not coming back, and I don't like seeing it there. I turned another page and found a name circled in red ink, no explanation beside it, just circled hard enough that the pen had torn through the paper. The name was Ostrowski. I sat with that logbook a long time before I put it back. My grandfather worked steel mills in Pennsylvania before I was born. I'd never known which one. I told myself the name was common enough among Polish families in that part of the state that it meant nothing. I still photographed the page. When I looked at the photo later that night, the circled name wasn't visible in the image at all, the rest of the entry was perfectly legible, but that one line was a blur, like the camera had refused to focus on it no matter how still my hand had been. Day 6, I asked Henrik directly if he knew anything about a worker who'd gone missing from Furnace 3. He went quiet in a way that told me more than words would have. Eventually he said there'd been an incident in 1967, a man lost near the furnace during a night shift, no body ever recovered, the official report calling it a fall into the slag pit, which happened more often in those years than anyone likes to admit. He said the company settled with the family and the story got buried the way those stories usually did back then. He said the man's name wasn't Ostrowski, it was something else, but that there'd been others over the decades, small accidents, unexplained ones, and that long-time workers had a superstition about the furnace remembering people. I asked him if he believed that. He looked at me for a long moment and said he'd worked there 30 years and he'd stopped needing to believe things to respect them. That should have been the moment I packed up and told the development company I'd finished the survey remotely from photographs and old blueprints. Instead, I told myself one more day would let me finish the ore yard section and close the contract clean. I've replayed that decision more times than I can count. Day 7, I went into the blowing engine house alone, later than I meant to, because I'd lost track of time cross-referencing beam corrosion against the 1962 structural plans. The cold hit me the second I crossed the threshold, sharper than it had been all week, and my breath fogged so thick I could barely see past it. My flashlight beam caught movement near the base of the old engine, a shape that resolved, for less than a second, into the outline of a man in period work clothes, standing with his back to me, exactly where the plans showed a catwalk that had been removed in a 1974 renovation and never rebuilt. There was no catwalk there. There was a 40-foot drop to the concrete floor below. And there was, unmistakably, in that half-second before my light adjusted and the shape resolved into nothing but shadow and rust texture, someone standing on air. I didn't run, because my legs wouldn't let me. I backed out slowly, the way you're taught to move away from something dangerous rather than turn your back on it, and it was only once I was out of the engine house that I realized the corridor behind me had changed. The exit I'd used all week wasn't where it should have been. In its place was a stretch of shop floor I didn't recognize, machinery I hadn't documented, rows of dark hulking presses under a ceiling that dripped condensation onto concrete that was somehow wet in a building that had been bone dry every day prior. I checked my clipboard against my own hand-drawn map. Nothing matched. I told myself I'd taken a wrong turn in the dark, that the mind fills gaps under stress, and I started walking in the direction I believed was east, toward the gate I'd parked outside every morning. The hammer sound started again, closer this time, coming from everywhere and nowhere the way sound does in a space that big, rhythmic, patient, like it had been waiting for company. Somewhere behind that rhythm, faint, I heard my own name. Not shouted. Said, almost gently, the way a foreman might call a man back to his station. I did not turn toward it. I kept my light forward and my feet moving, past rows of machinery that shouldn't have still had their guarding intact, past a wall of employee lockers, one of them hanging open with a jacket still inside it, decades of dust on every surface except that jacket, which looked freshly hung. Further on, the shop floor opened into a space I hadn't documented on any of my 7 days there, a long room lined with what looked like inspection stations, each one fitted with a stool and a small overhead lamp, most of the lamps dark, one of them lit, humming a weak yellow glow over an empty stool. I didn't stop to look closer. I've thought since about what I might have found sitting on that stool if I had, and I've decided I'm grateful I never found out. Past the inspection stations, the floor sloped down slightly toward a set of double doors marked in stenciled paint too fresh for a building that hadn't been painted since before I was born. Furnace 3 authorized personnel. I felt, more than heard, a pull toward those doors, an urge that didn't feel entirely like my own curiosity, the way you sometimes feel drawn to look over the edge of somewhere high even when you know better. I made myself walk past them instead. I still don't know if that was the right choice or if it only postponed something. I don't fully remember the walk after that. What I do remember is finding myself at the perimeter fence, disoriented, my hands scraped from climbing over chain link I had no memory of approaching, my phone dead though it had been at half charge when I entered, and my watch reading nearly 4 hours later than what I believed had passed. Henrik found me sitting against my truck in the gravel lot an hour after sunrise, when he came to open the gate for the day's public tours. He didn't ask many questions. He just told me to go home, and that he'd handle the rest of the survey himself. I filed my report the following week using photographs I'd taken in the first 4 days, before things stopped adding up, and blueprints the development company already had on file. I never went back inside. I told my supervisor the remaining sections were structurally unsound and too dangerous to access without additional shoring, which wasn't exactly a lie. 3 months later, out of curiosity I've regretted more than once, I called the County Historical Society and asked about steelworkers named Ostrowski employed at that plant. There had been one, decades before my grandfather's time, according to a scanned employment card they eventually found and emailed me. Furnace crew. No listed date of departure, only a note that his file had been closed administratively in 1967, the same year Henrik mentioned. I don't know if we're related. I've decided some questions are safer left unanswered. I called Henrik once more before I closed the contract out, mostly to thank him and mostly, if I'm honest, because I needed to hear from someone who'd actually been there that I hadn't imagined the whole week. He was quieter than usual on the phone. He told me the development company had shelved the loft conversion indefinitely after my report came back flagging the older sections as structurally unpredictable, which was the closest I could come to writing the truth without anyone questioning my judgment. He also told me something I hadn't asked for. He said that in 30 years working that mill, he'd never once gone into the blowing engine house after dark, not because of any rule, but because his own father, who'd worked the furnaces before him, told him never to answer if he heard his name called back there, and Henrik had simply never tested whether that advice still mattered. I didn't ask him what happened to make his father say it. Some things, I've learned, are better left as inheritance rather than explanation. I still drive past the plant sometimes, on my way to a job in the Lehigh Valley, and I still see the furnace towers lit up at night for the tourists and the concertgoers who have no idea what sits behind the fence in the older buildings. Last month, driving past close to midnight, I saw a single light burning in the blowing engine house, steady and orange, exactly where no wiring has run power in almost 30 years. I didn't stop the truck to look closer. Some nights, I still hear that hammer, slow and even, right at the edge of sleep, and I lie there wondering whether it's memory or whether, somewhere behind that fence, it never actually stopped.